Good evening, everyone. Welcome tonight, a special night, and I'm starting out with one of our very special guests. Some of you might know that we have the great privilege of having a living composer here, but more than that, he's a great living composer, and he's from Buffalo. So we welcome back Paul Moravec to his hometown. I'm going to give you this, Paul. And you're about to hear tonight a piece you probably have not heard. It is a piece for cello and orchestra. And the other delightful thing about this venture together is that Roman Mekinulov, who I know many of you know and love, our principal cellist, has taken on the delightful role of soloist tonight in this piece, and I think Roman has done a spectacular job. So, before we talk about the piece, Paul, remind people a little bit about your Buffalo background.
Can you hear me? Great. I was born in Buffalo General Hospital 54 years ago. How much time do we have? And we moved to, my dad worked for Bethlehem Steel, remember Bethlehem Steel, his entire life. And we moved away and then we came back. He was still working for Bethlehem. And basically, in the early 70s, I went to Nichols for a few years. I sang in the Men and Boys Choir of St. Paul's Cathedral. I came to see the Buffalo Philharmonic every chance I could. That would have been Lucas Foss in his final years, and with the orchestra, and then Michael Tilson Thomas. And so this hall is my education. This is very important part of my apprenticeship.
Were you already thinking about composing in those years? I mean, listening to Foss and Michael Tilson Thomas, were you already putting things down on paper?
Sure. Buffalo has, since World War II, been a center for contemporary music. It's very happening right now. It was very much happening at that time in the 70s, and it was just an exciting and stimulating and extremely educational time to be living here.
Well, Paul and I worked together before a number of times when we were just out of school. And I think at that time I didn't realize that you were from Buffalo. But when I found out years later, I think after I heard this wonderful piece, it just was a natural thing that we bring this piece to Buffalo. And I have fallen in love with it. I think our orchestra has. I know they have, and Roman has. So Montserrat, this is the piece we're talking about, Montserrat. Tell us a little bit about the title, first of all, is interesting.
Yeah. First of all, I want to say something about JoAnn. She's my hero because JoAnn commissioned my first orchestra piece in 1988, and that was for the Denver
Chamber Orchestra. My very first job. I was still in school then. I think I was still at Juilliard, and we brought Paul out to Colorado, and it was a wonderful experience. And so it's several years later, but here we are with this wonderful piece.
Montserrat is a mountain in Catalonia in southern Spain. It's about an hour north of Barcelona, and it's the site of an ancient and extremely distinguished monastery of the same name. My wife and I, Wendy's here, just so you know, she and I were visiting Montserrat about 20 years ago. And there's a statue of Pablo Casals, the great cellist, actually in front of the monastery there. And it's a wonderful statue. It's a majestic sight. And he's playing the cello, and he's looking out towards the Mediterranean and everything. It's very inspiring. So I wrote this piece about this whole thing. And so the conceit of it is that Casals, he starts playing the piece, and Roman will be Casals tonight. He starts playing the piece, and then other cellists in the world start to hear his song, and they pick up his strains. And then all the musicians in the world come in and join Casals, and it's about Casals and musicians playing forever, and with him at the lead on top of Montserrat.
It's very heroic. It's kind of like a force for good in the world. I mean, the voice of Pablo Casals, which he was.
Which he was. I mean, you might know he was a great humanitarian, very important voice in the newly formed United Nations, after the war and so on. Yeah. And he was quite a guy.
You know, the idea of this monastery and the music that was kept as treasures in the monastery from the 16th century, 17th century, informs this piece in a very big way. And I think this, for me, some of the most magical connections are with this Monteverdi-like music. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, one of the things that this piece does, it's a kind of dialogue between the new and the old, you know, the 21st century and medieval, Renaissance, Baroque, whatever. The music is based on a plain chant, which begins the Magnificat that Monteverdi uses in the final movement of the Vespers, a piece one of the great things ever written. Anyways, I took that plain chant and based the entire piece on it. In particular, the opening three notes of the Magnificat, which are da da da, just like that. It begins actually da da da. It begins with a kind of minor mode inflection, and then goes from there.
So those are the Roman's first three notes that he plays.
Three notes. And so there's a kind of Monteverdi vibe in this piece, and there are sections of it that are somewhat in the way that Stravinsky kind of reinvented Renaissance and Baroque practices. There's a little bit of that in this piece as well. It's a kind of reinterpretation, a kind of modernist take on ancient practices, and that informs this piece.
I found that so magical, because you hear moments when you're really drawn back into that medieval world, but then you open it up and we're back in the full sound of a 21st century orchestra playing romantically and with full voice, but there's always that underpinning of the past, which is and it ends in that kind of quiet, austere way.
Right. I mean, I think of it as a spiritual piece. I mean, that's certainly the context of Montserrat and Casals at Montserrat is certainly spiritual, ultimately.
Well, you're in for an amazing experience in contemporary music, to hear this piece and to discover it along with us. We've had all week to live with it and to fall in love with it, which we absolutely have. But I think that at a first hearing, you will feel the same sense of wonder in this fantastic piece. And I feel so privileged, Paul, that you are here and that you come back to Buffalo and given us the opportunity to play one of the first performances of this work. So
I'm beside myself with excitement.
Well, we are very happy too.
Pleasure,
Thank you. Well, we'll give Paul a chance to relax a little bit before hearing it, but thank you, Paul. Thank you. I'll just take this.
Okay.
Thank you. You're wonderful. Always is exciting to have as a centerpiece a living composer, and this is very special for me, knowing Paul for since school days, really. So I'm excited about that. And we're surrounding this heroic piece because I do think of Pablo Casals as a force for peace, as a force for good, as a force for humanity, by two other pieces that are centered on heroism. First of all, an overture by Beethoven. Now, Beethoven, of course, you know, when we talk about heroes, Beethoven is a hero in so many ways. He's a musical hero, changing the shape of our musical world. He's a historic hero in a way of changing how people viewed artists and how people viewed the individual. And his opera, his only opera, Beethoven was not a person who really made opera a big part of his work, but he did write one opera, Fidelio, and it was about heroism. The story of Fidelio is about Florestan, who's been unjustly imprisoned for political reasons, and the heroism of his wife, Lenore, who disguises herself as a man, calls herself Fidelio, and enters the prison as a worker to try to rescue him. And her faithfulness, her loyalty, her love for him, and her complete courage is the story of the opera. Now, Beethoven was struggling with the overture to Fidelio, which was originally called Lenore. The opera was called Lenore after her real name. And you might know that there's a Lenore Overture number 1, there's a Lenore Overture number 2, and there's a Lenore Overture number 3. And even then, he didn't really get what he wanted. So he finally wrote the 4th one, and he changed the name to Fidelio. So if you go to hear the opera, the overture that you hear is that number 4, Fidelio. That's the time he felt, okay, this is right for the opera. And this is an example, this Lenore number 3, of a piece that wasn't that it wasn't good. It was that it was too good. And Beethoven realized that this piece was too dramatic to set the stage for an opera. Now, I might have told you before, opera overtures at that time were not really very serious things. Rossini invented the quintessential opera overture, which was a kind of frothy, brilliant beginning of an opera, really designed to get people to stop talking and quiet down. This was in Italy, and people were still jabbering, and they would be, not really willing to quiet down. But he wrote opera overtures that would just set the scene for them to sort of, okay, come on, let's get serious. Here's the opera. But Beethoven didn't think of it that way. He was writing. It was sort of an encapsulated version of the opera. And in a sense, he felt in Lenore 3 that he told the whole story in this 15-minute piece, that maybe there was nothing else to follow. He gave it all away, in a sense. There was a critic who said, this is very, very interesting, the trouble with Lenore number 3 is that, like all of Beethoven's great instrumental music, it is about 10 times as dramatic as anything that could possibly happen on the stage. So Beethoven realized that that wasn't really quite what he had in mind. He even gives away in the overture, which he does not in Fidelio overture, he changed it, he took it out, the dramatic moment when from the prison, Florestan and Leonore hear the sound of the governor coming with the army to rescue them. The sound of the governor's trumpet, right? The trumpeter coming from the distance, and he gets closer, and they know that help is coming. So you even hear that in this overture. You hear the whole story in a kind of dramatic way. So it's become one of the great instrumental pieces, orchestral pieces on its own, even though it's no longer used in the opera. Fidelio is used, but you will recognize this, I think, and enjoy it. The second half. We turn to another piece of great heroism, this by Sergei Prokofiev, his 5th symphony, one of the truly greatest symphonies ever written. Prokofiev lived a life, a very varied life, ultimately an incredibly tragic life, and he is an example to us of an artist who is living a life of complete desperation, of artistic desperation, with constraints that are so severe that it was amazing that we're able to hear his voice today, given the situation that he lived in. His life didn't start in this way. He actually was born in Tsarist Russia under Nicholas and Alexandra to a wealthy family. And his mother was a very fine pianist, and she started teaching him piano at a very early age. And Prokofiev was an astonishing prodigy in every way, as a pianist, as a composer, much like Mozart. By the time he was 5, he was writing music. By 9, he had written 2 operas. He was a dazzling pianist of extraordinary technique. And his family lived in the Ukraine, but since it was very cold there, they would come to spend the winters in a warmer place. They would come down to Moscow to spend the winters there. And in Moscow, Prokofiev soaked up the musical life, and he went to the conservatory. He went to St. Petersburg Conservatory, and he was the most unruly, most undisciplined, most difficult student, I think, that the conservatory ever had. I mean, he had wonderful teachers, Rimsky-Korsakov, Lyadov, and he listened to none of them. He broke every rule. He wrote what he wanted. A very, very difficult but brilliant student. He was a genius and went his own way. And his music to his teachers was horrifically modern. Remember, they're still thinking of Tchaikovsky as a kind of the quintessential Russian voice. Even though Prokofiev doesn't sound that modern to us, to them it was very, very startling. Now, around this time, Russia was starting to change. And of course, in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution came. Prokofiev, all of his life, professed and truly was an apolitical person. But he was very concerned when the Bolsheviks came to power because things were in terrible disarray. And he felt there was no place for art. There was no place to make music. So he left. He applied for permission to leave, and he was granted miraculously permission to leave, and he went first to the USA. He was in the United States from 1918 to 1922, performing as a pianist and also writing music. And he achieved special success in Chicago. And the people of Chicago, Chicago Symphony and Chicago Lyric Opera, still feel a very special bond with Prokofiev because he was extremely well received in that city. Some of his pieces were premiered there. He wrote his opera For Love of Three Oranges for the Chicago Lyric Opera. And the people in Chicago really, really enjoyed having him as a living composer there. There's an interesting story about Prokofiev. For all that he wasn't political, he wasn't a capitalist either. And there was a point when he was writing the opera For Love of Three Oranges when the opera company was running out of money. So even then, of course, this has been always the case. So they were having problems. But then, much to everyone's delight, they found a sponsor for their opera. And the sponsor for Love of Three Oranges was Sunkist. And Sunkist decided, now I don't even know if the president of Sunkist knew what the opera was about, but he liked the title of the opera. So Sunkist said, okay, we'll sponsor this opera, and not only that, we'll give a free orange to everyone who comes. But there was a quid pro quo, and that was that Prokofiev had to say first that he only would eat Sunkist oranges, and that also it was the taste of this very succulent fruit that inspired him to write this opera. And Prokofiev said no, that he wouldn't go that far. And somehow they worked it all out, and the opera did take place. But Prokofiev felt, well, maybe he didn't understand the United States. He moved to Paris and lived in Paris for a while. He met his wife in Paris, a Spanish singer, and they had two sons. And then for some reason, 1936, Prokofiev made what was to prove to be the worst decision of his life. He decided to go back to the Soviet Union, which was then the Soviet Union under Stalin. And he mistakenly thought that since he was apolitical and had no interest in politics and no particular leanings one way or the other, that would be fine. He could go back and be an artist. He could be a musician. He was homesick. I mean, he wasn't the only one. Of course, you know, Rachmaninoff came to the United States and longed every day of his life to go back to Russia, but would not go back until the Tsar came back. So he died in the United States and is buried in the United States. Stravinsky also, many, many great Russians came but would not go back. But Prokofiev decided to go back. And the Soviet Union was an extraordinarily difficult place for artists. Stalin, who was probably the worst tyrant and murderer that the world has ever known. I mean, there's just millions of deaths he was directly responsible for. Was a very crude man. He was not an artistic person, but he knew something about music. He knew the most important thing about music for him, and that was that music influenced people. And music could inspire people. It could work them up. It could get them to do things. It could create a situation where powerful things could happen because people responded to music. So he created very strict guidelines for the kind of music that could be written. It had to be morally sound. It had to be socially uplifting. It had to appeal to the masses. It had to be easily understood by every person. It should look to the traditions of the past, use folk material, and always be positive. So you could imagine this is the 1930s, and the world is in disarray. 1930s and 40s. How could artists respond to this? Plus, how would they ever know if they were doing what he wanted? It was impossible with music, which is it doesn't have specific meaning often, to know if you had done the right thing or not. And if you didn't do the right thing, the consequences were dire. There were many, many, many artists who were killed or sent to Siberia, just disappeared. There's a story of Shostakovich, I might have told you, where Shostakovich, who lived under the same horrible iron fist of Stalin, would never know if what he had written would be condemned or not. So he would take to sitting in the hallway at night in his apartment building. He'd sit right outside his door with a little suitcase because the KGB or whatever they were called at this point would always come at night so that your neighbors would not see them taking you. You would just disappear. So he would sit out there with his little suitcase hoping that if they came, that they would leave his wife alone and they would just take him. He spent night after night sitting. It was a horrific environment and no one knew who would be next to go. And Prokofiev lived through this just with his music being condemned by Stalin, which not only meant it wasn't played, but you were in terrible terrible danger. In fact, his wife was deported and sent to Siberia. He never saw her again because she was a foreigner. She was Spanish. So it was just a dreadful life for him. And much music wasn't played there. I remember a long time ago when I was a student, I was conducting an orchestra, and we had in New York at that time, New York City, a lot of Soviet emigres had come, and they were willing to work in orchestras with young conductors and students, and because they needed the money. And there was this older Russian gentleman. We were playing Tchaikovsky 1812 Overture. Oh, we didn't think much of it. We played that all the time. You know, we knew it. And I noticed that Mark was crying at the end of that. And I went back to ask him, to talk to him. I said, what happened? He said, I never heard this piece. He said, we were not allowed to hear it in Russia because it was about a foreign country that they were supposed to have no interest in. So the 1812 Overture was even Tchaikovsky, their number one composer, they weren't allowed to play the 1812 Overture. So this piece came about at a dire time in the Soviet Union. It was 1944, and you can imagine how much the Soviet people were suffering during the war, and the deprivation, the starvation, the disease. It was the most dire time in that country. So Stalin decided that it was time to have all of his composers write symphonies that would glorify war, what he called, I think, the Great Patriotic War. They were all instructed that they had to write rousing pieces that would get everyone sort of on board again with the great war that they were fighting. And Prokofiev, in a moment of unbelievable courage, refused to do that. He said, war is abhorrent. A composer has to celebrate life and protect it. I will never write a piece glorifying war. Instead, he wrote this piece, this Fifth Symphony. And it's filled with pain. I mean, you'll hear that. You listen to the third movement. It's filled with pain. It's filled with suffering. I mean, he could not ignore what was happening. But I think you also feel the kind of life force in it and the energy in it. And at the end, it seems frenetic and it seems wild. But at the end, there's a kind of hope in the spirit of a human being that no matter what happens, what is best in people will survive. And that's what he hoped for. And this piece was condemned, and it effectively ended his career in the Soviet Union, the writing of this piece. But it stands as a kind of testament to people who choose a very difficult path because they believe so much in the possibility of goodness in man, even though they are seeing the worst. And it's become that kind of legacy that he gives us. And I think the musicians and I, when we do this piece, which is not that often, we realize what kind of a world we're in and what we're expressing in the courage of this man to write this piece, sealing a kind of death warrant for himself. When Prokofiev died several years later in a terrible stroke of irony, he lived every day of his life since he came back under Stalin. Stalin died on exactly the same day as he did. So he was not free of Stalin for even one day. But he's left us this incredible gift of a wonderful symphony. So I hope you enjoy this theme of courage and heroism that we set tonight. We have just a few minutes. I would like to play you our best, Danny, to play a little bit over the speakers, something a little bit more lighthearted, and that is an excerpt from our brand new CD, George Gershwin. Now, George Gershwin and the BPO have a long history. Some of you remember Michael Tilson Thomas and his love of Gershwin and his recordings of the music of Gershwin. Naxos has just issued this week a brand new CD of the music of Gershwin with our orchestra. So we'll play a little bit of I Got Rhythm Variations for you, and we hope you enjoy that. We hope you enjoy the concert tonight. Thank you.